Please open your Bibles to the book of Esther, the 17th book of the Old Testament. This book tells a story of a young Jewish woman who ends up becoming the queen of the Persian Empire. And she, along with the help of her cousin Mordecai, ends up being used by God to bring about a great deliverance for the Jews from a plot by their enemies to annihilate them. And in this way, the book of Esther becomes an important part of the story of the Bible because it shows us how God preserved His chosen people for the coming of the Messiah and Savior of the world. Because without the Jewish nation, there could be no Jewish Messiah. Ruling on the throne of the ancient Jewish King David, to whom God made a promise to establish His throne forever. And there would be no promised seed of Abraham through whom all nations would be blessed, as those who believe in Jesus find salvation from sin in a fallen world. In fact, the story of Esther highlights the sinfulness of a fallen world as it draws attention to the corrupt culture of the Persian Empire, which surprisingly looks pretty similar to our own culture today. It also shows us how the people of God can get tangled up into the mess of their own sinful surroundings, and how all too often it can seem like God is absent in the world, when in fact He is actually very present, even in the messiness of our lives, as He brings about His redemptive purposes. And in this way, the story of Esther becomes a beautiful reminder to us of the faithfulness of God to keep His promises, not because of the faithfulness of His people, but because of who He is in His own being and gracious character. The story of Esther takes place during the days of the Persian Empire, about 100 years after Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians, and the surviving Jews were then taken away into captivity in Babylon. It's a story that happens during the period, the same time as Ezra and Nehemiah, after Cyrus, the first king of the Persian Empire, issued a decree for the temple to be rebuilt in Jerusalem and allowing any willing Jew to return to the Promised Land. And in those previous books of Ezra and Nehemiah, the story was told of the Jews who returned from exile to rebuild the temple along with the walls around Jerusalem and to rebuild their lives as God's people, reestablishing God's law in the land of Israel. This fact alone actually raises a question at the beginning of the book of Esther as to why there are some Jews who decided not to return to Jerusalem, but who decided to actually remain in Persia. Why didn't they join the others as they sought to reestablish true worship in Israel and recenter their lives around God's Word? We're simply not told. We simply discover that there's a community of Jews living in the capital of the Persian Empire in the midst of a corrupt and ungodly culture. Something that's highlighted in the opening verses of Esther as the Persian king, Ahasuerus, throws a feast for all of his officials and servants in which, according to verse 4, he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days. And this lasted 180 days. This was followed by another week-long festival in the capital where, according to verses 7 and 8, drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds. And the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king, and drinking was according to this edict. There's no compulsion. For the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. Now, it doesn't take much imagination to figure out what kind of party this ended up turning into when people drank as much as they wanted and essentially did whatever they wanted. And that the only rule was, apparently, that there are none. At the end of this second feast of 7 days, the king then commanded that his wife, Queen Vashti, be brought before the king with her royal crown in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty. Now he's going to show her off on top of everything else. But Queen Vashti refused. She refused to come at the king's command and refused to parade herself before these drunken men at this gathering. And the king was enraged. So he took counsel with his wise men, so-called, asking them what should be done with Queen Vashti, and fearing that her behavior would be known to all the women throughout this great empire, who would then look down at their own husbands with contempt. They decided that Queen Vashti should be deposed and her royal position given to another. And a decree was made by the king proclaiming that every man is to be the master of his own household, and that all women must give honor to their husbands. Kind of an ironic decree in light of what just happened. And instead of simply recognizing that the king's command that Vashti refused was just a foolish request from a drunken man, the officials of the empire take her refusal as a threat against their own fragile egos and sense of control, and they rally to save face by enforcing their dominance throughout the empire, making every man the master of his own. And so right away in the story, we're given a picture of the culture in which this story takes place, as we see a 6-month celebration of power and of wealth through drunkenness and through lust after beauty. And we see how those in power who are free to indulge in all these things are actually not powerful or free at all, but are fragile as they fall apart when a single woman refuses to parade herself before them. In that moment, they felt their whole world threatened and immediately tried to secure their sense of power and control by declaring every man master of his own home, as we just saw. As great and as powerful as they thought that they were so fragile and so easily broken. As we turn to chapter 2, the king's anger had abated, and he starts to miss the queen. So according to verse 2 through to verse 4, then the king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the citadel, under custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases a king be queen instead of Vashti." And this pleased the king, and he did so. Now this was far from being just your ordinary beauty pageant. These young women were not volunteers, freely competing for an opportunity to become queen, after which they could then return home and live their own lives however they pleased. These young women were gathered throughout the empire and taken into custody. It was essentially abduction. This is when we're introduced to Esther in the story, and to her cousin Mordecai, who took her as his own daughter after her parents had died. We read in verse 8, when the king's order and his edict was proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Haggai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who was in charge of the women. So Esther was taken, and Esther was put in custody, which means she was not there as a volunteer, but she was there by force. And Mordecai, who went to the harem every day to check on Esther, actually commanded Esther to keep her Jewish identity a secret, which once again actually raises more questions about the devotion of these Jews to God, the devotion of these Jews who had chosen to remain in Persia, in the capital of this ungodly empire, rather than return to Jerusalem. Apparently, Mordecai wanted Esther to simply blend in with the other women and not stand out for her Jewish identity, which we can only assume was for her protection. But only adding to this concern about their devotion is the fact that this pageant wasn't simply based on their beautiful appearance. For after spending 12 months in one harem, undergoing extensive beauty treatments, each young woman would then be brought to the king in order to spend the night with him. According to verse 14, in the evening she would go into the king, and in the morning she would return to a second harem in custody of Shazgaz, a different name here, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. That's what they're becoming here after this night. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. This means that young women throughout the Persian Empire were taken for their beautiful appearance, were then dressed up in order to be used by the king for his pleasure, so that he could then choose his favorite one among them as his queen, while leaving the rest in his harem of concubines as his sensual possessions. And the one that the king chose above all the other women, for both her beauty and how she delighted him, was Esther, whom he names queen in place of Vashti, throwing another great feast in celebration. Now, even though we might read this today and shake our heads at the whole scene in disapproval, what we're seeing is really not that different from our own culture today, though it might play out differently, because our own culture today also lives for power and wealth, also idolizes sex, and values others by their external beauty and by what they can do for you. While people today might be surprised by the king's beauty pageant in the story, in the details of it, as countless women are taken so that the king can spend the night with them and then choose his favorite, the ancient Persians might be equally surprised by our own culture of dating apps and hookups, where people are still measured by external beauty, and which in the aftermath leaves many, many people feeling used. And so while it might not be as royal, and it might not be as seemingly mandatory, the culture today is really not that different, because it pressures countless people into conforming to its false value systems and to compete for people's lustful desires and attention. But just as we see in the story, none of these things can actually pay out the freedom that they promise to our lives. But instead, they expose us in our sin as we're left desperately trying to find life in a broken world and striving to maintain this fragile sense of control. This becomes especially evident as we're introduced to another character in the story in chapter 3, to a man named Haman, who, according to verse 1, was an Agagite, which takes us all the way back to the days of Samuel, and to the Amalekites and to their king, King Agag, which suggests here that Haman is a descendant from the historic enemies of Israel, and an enmity that he obviously lives up to in this story. Haman is elevated by the king above all his other officials, and all people are commanded to bow before him. But Esther's cousin Mordecai refused to bow before him. And according to verses 5 and 6 of chapter 3, when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. So once again, we see someone with the height of earthly power becoming unhinged by one person refusing to honor them as they want and expect, showing once again how earthly power and status can't actually satisfy our hearts, but only leave us empty and fragile from behind the appearance of looking full and secure. Haman goes before the king with his new power and position and tells him about a dispersed people throughout his kingdom who don't keep the king's laws and who are not profitable to him. He then bribes the king with a huge amount of silver to decree that these people be destroyed. And the king signs off on the edict. And according to verse 13, letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with instruction to destroy, to kill, and annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. This day was chosen by Haman through rolling the dice or casting lots. Then Haman and the king, after making this edict, they sit down to drink and celebrate, while the city is thrown into confusion, and while throughout the empire there's great mourning among the Jews as they fast and weep, wearing sackcloth and ashes. It's this horrible, stark contrast. Mordecai learns of the decree in chapter 4, and he urges Esther to go to the king and to beg his favor, pleading on behalf of her people. But Esther explains in verse 11 that all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law: to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I've not been called to come into the king these 30 days. So even though Esther's queen, she doesn't seem to have any official power. Essentially, her position is for display purposes only. She couldn't just appear before the king unless she was summoned, which she hadn't been for a month. So if she just walked in before him, she could be executed for doing so. But in verses 13 and 14, Mordecai replies to Esther saying, "Don't think to yourself that in the king's palace you'll escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this." Then Esther agreed and called Mordecai to gather the Jews together for 3 days of fasting, saying that she herself would fast along with her young women, and then she would go to the king, though it was against the law, saying, "If I perish, I perish." In chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, we read that on the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. The king then asked her what her request was, promising that he would give it to her, even if it was up to half his kingdom. And she responded very tactfully. Knowing the king's character and knowing what his desires were, what kind of man he's like, she invited the king and Haman to come to a special feast that she prepared for him. So the king and Haman quickly go to her banquet to feast with her. The king would have been very happy at this because he loved to be celebrated. He loved to party. He loved to drink. And Haman would have also been very happy because he loved to be made much of. And being the only other person invited besides the king, he would have felt that he was the most important man in the world next to the king. And so the king asked Esther again at her banquet for him what her request was, what her wish was, again promising her up to half the kingdom. And Esther asked for the king and Haman to once again come to another feast tomorrow, where she would make her request known to the king. And so at the end of the night, Haman goes out from this feast feeling pretty good about himself, until he saw Mordecai, who once again refuses to bow to him. And Haman is filled with wrath. He goes home where he praises himself before his wife and his friends, recounting the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, and all the promotions that the king honored him with, and how he was the only person in the empire that Esther invited with the king to a special feast. But then Haman vents in verse 13, saying, "Yet all this is worth nothing to me, as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." And then his wife and friends all tell him that he should build a huge gallows, 50 cubits high, which a cubit is 1.5 feet, so 75 feet high, and then have Mordecai killed on it in the morning. Just take care of it. Build this place, kill your enemy, have at it, be done with it. And Haman, of course, loves this idea and is all of a sudden glad again as he builds the gallows where he intends to kill Mordecai. Once again, we're reminded how fragile sin makes our hearts, and how the things of this world always fail to deliver on the promises to satisfy our hearts. Because even if you get everything the world says you should have, like Haman, you discover that it's still not enough. That your heart still feels empty, and you still fall apart so easily like Ahasuerus when the queen wouldn't parade herself before his guests, and here like Haman, when one solitary Jew wouldn't bow before him in the street. When God isn't king over our hearts, and when he isn't the point of our lives, we end up putting ourselves on the throne in his place, living to satisfy self as though we were the point. But real life is never found in living to exalt ourselves. But when we live this way, things so easily and so often fall apart. Now, at this point in the story, things look pretty hopeless. The decree for the destruction of the Jews, it's still in effect. And Haman has now built gallows where he plans to kill Mordecai the next morning before going to Esther's next feast. But it's at this point in the story, beginning in chapter 6, when things look like they couldn't get any worse, that everything actually starts turning around. For that night, as Haman is plotting the death of Mordecai, the king can't sleep. And so the king gives orders to have the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, read to him. And as this happens, the king is reminded how Mordecai had previously uncovered a plot against the king's life from early in the story, back in chapter 2. And then he realizes that Mordecai was never actually honored for saving the king's life. And it's at this moment in the story when Haman shows up in the king's court in order to ask about killing Mordecai on the gallows he made in front of his house. But before he gets the chance to ask, the king asks Haman in verse 6, "What should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor?" And Haman says to himself, "Whom would the king like to honor more than me?" And so in verses 7 and 9, Haman says to the king, "Well, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.'" So in verse 10, the king says to Haman, "Hurry, Haman, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai, the Jew, who sits at the king's gate, and leave out nothing that you've mentioned." So instead of killing the man who wouldn't bow to him, Haman spends the day parading this man around the city and declaring his honor by the king, vividly illustrating the truth that everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Then, according to verses 12 to 14, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house mourning and with his head covered. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. And then his wise men and his wife Zeresh, recognizing the truth of the events, they said to him, "If Mordecai before whom you begun to fall is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him." And while they were still talking, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. He doesn't even have time to mourn his situation or the ominous prophecy that was just stated by his wife. He's rushed away to this next banquet, which brings us to chapter 7, where the king and Haman gather with Esther for a second feast. And as they're drinking wine afterwards, and the king repeats his offer to Esther, asking, "What's your wish? What's your request?" Promising again that it would be granted to her, even up to half his kingdom. This time, Esther answers the king in verses 3 and 4, saying, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. And then in verse 5, King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he, who has dared to do this?" And Esther replied in verse 6, "A foe and an enemy, the wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. For the first time in the story, Esther reveals her identity, that she is in fact a Jew. And she reveals that when the king signed off on the destruction of the Jews, he signed her death warrant as well. Upon hearing this, the king gets up in his wrath from the wine, and he goes out into the palace garden. But Haman stayed behind to plead for his life from the queen. And as Haman was falling down on the couch in desperation before her, the king returns and thinks Haman's trying to assault his wife. So Haman's immediately seized with his face covered, and after learning that Haman had built gallows at his house in order to kill Mordecai, who had saved the king's life, the king orders that Haman be executed there in the very place he intended to kill Mordecai. As we turn to chapter 8, the reversal continues as the king then elevates Mordecai to a position of honor and power, giving him this signet ring that had previously been given to Haman, and Mordecai being set over the house of Haman. Esther then pleads with the king to spare her people, but under Persian law, an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring could not be revoked. So the king advised them to write a new edict in his name and seal it with the king's ring that had been given now to Mordecai. The king's scribes were summoned, and a new edict was written and sent throughout all 127 provinces of the empire, from India to Ethiopia, that allowed the Jews in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy their enemies and annihilate any armed force that might attack them. And according to verse 17 of chapter 8, we read that in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. Then according to chapter 9, verses 1 to 5, when that fateful day had arrived, when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain mastery over them, the reverse occurred. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. And no one could stand against them, for the fear of them had fallen on all peoples. All the officials of the provinces, and the satraps and the governors and the royal agents also helped the Jews, for the fear of Mordecai had fallen on them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces, for the man Mordecai grew more and more powerful. The Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and did as they pleased to those who hated them. Then in verses 13 and 14, Esther said, "If it please the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict. And let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows." So the king commanded this to be done. A decree was issued in Susa, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. So the Jews were not only spared from their destruction, but they overcame their enemies who plotted against them, and the fear of them fell on all the people throughout the empire. So to commemorate how their sorrows were turned into gladness, they inaugurated a special holiday in which they were to feast with gladness and send gifts to each other and give gifts to the poor. And they named this feast Purim, after the manner in which Haman had decided the day of the destruction, when he cast lots, which is like casting dice, called Pur. And so the book that began with a celebration of the king's greatness now ends with a declaration of Mordecai's greatness, highlighting how the king exalted this man, this otherwise obscure Jewish man, to being second in rank to the king himself, and how Mordecai sought the welfare of the Jews, speaking peace to all his people. And that's the story of Esther. And so, what are we to take away from this book? From this story where God is apparently hidden from our eyes, not even being mentioned by name. A story where we find a community of Jews choosing to stay in the capital of an ungodly empire instead of returning to the promised land and remaining mixed up in that corrupt culture. Where the heroine in the story tries to blend in with the corrupt culture, even winning a contest for beauty and pleasure, while hiding her identity as one of God's chosen people. Well, I think that these concerning elements in the story and the questions that they raise in our minds actually work together to make a very important point in the story, that in the words of one pastor, God's protection isn't based on our performance, but on His providence. As we come to the end of the book, and are still left unsure what to think about the moral integrity and the devotion, even of its main characters, what is sure beyond all doubt is God's commitment to preserving and protecting His people, even in a story where He's never named, and where even prayer, while it is assumed at times, is never actually explicitly mentioned. It's a story where God is clearly at work behind the scenes in the messy lives of His people in order to deliver them from their enemies and in order to preserve them for the fulfillment of His promises that bring us to Jesus, not because of who they are, but because of who God is. And that is such a great encouragement for our lives today, not because it excuses faithlessness, but because it reminds us of where hope is actually found. Not in our faithfulness or in our performance, but in God's faithfulness and in the actions of His providence as He brings about the redemptive purposes and accomplishes His will in our messy lives. And I think that this is where we can see how Esther points us to Jesus and to the gospel of His grace, because Jesus came into the ungodly kingdom of this world, which is hostile to the kingdom of God and to its king. So much so that even the religious leaders of His own people plotted against Him for His destruction, to save face, maintain control and power, like Haman did against Mordecai and of all God's chosen people. But just like in the story of Esther, where Haman was destroyed in the very place he intended to kill Mordecai, the place where Jesus was put to death by His enemies became the place where sin was defeated. The kingdom of this world was overcome and salvation was accomplished for His people. It was a place of reversal, just like in the story of Esther. Jesus delivers God's people not because of their faithfulness, but by dying for their unfaithfulness so that God's salvation can come to us not as a result of our performance, but as a result of His grace in our messy lives. And in this way, Esther prepares us for Jesus and prepares us for the gospel of God's grace by exposing the emptiness of living for this world, for things that can't satisfy, and by highlighting God's sovereign actions behind the scenes in order to save His needy and messy people, giving us hope in the midst of our imperfect and messy lives today. Let's pray.